The early 20th century was a grim time for Irish politics. The Home Rule debate was raging like wildfire all across the nation, not helped at all by the First World War, where both sides claimed that fighting for Britain overseas would secure their own political victory. The pro-Home Rule forces being encouraged to fight to prove their mettle in the eyes of the British, who were the final decision makers, or the anti-Home Rule forces who sought to do the same, albeit to prove that they deserved to stick with the Union. In this, the Irish Volunteers and the UVF would find themselves fighting side by side, where Ulster and Irish divisions shed the trenches in a sick irony. We often see this conflict through a 21st century lens, the rapid deterioration of the Irish question, as it is so aptly named, resulting in the Easter Rising and the comparatively heavy-handed British response, and then the subsequent Anglo-Irish conflict with its famous and daring German gun smuggling operations, and the natural progression and proliferation of armed Irish groups such as the Irish Volunteers, and later on the Irish Republican Army. But far north, another group was making their presence known. In a matter of weeks before Europe would be in the throes of a world war, the Unionists of Ulster had the same idea their nationalist counterparts would have only a month later. This was the Larne Gun Run, possibly the biggest gun run in Irish history, over 15 times as large as the Irish Volunteers' response, the Howth Gun Run. But maybe we're getting too ahead of ourselves. What was Home Rule? What was the UVF? And why on earth were members of Parliament planning a possible civil war? Let's start with the easiest. Home Rule is what you might call the moderation of an idea that had persisted for 800 years. Irishmen for centuries had sought total separation from the British crown, from men such as the Earl of Tyrone, who joined for the Spanish to stop the Elizabethan horrors in his nation, which deserves a video in its own right, or the United Irishmen, who joined Napoleon and his continental force in a vain attempt to end British rule. By 1870, however, the idea of a violent upheaval was seeming increasingly impossible as the British Imperium expanded. So they turned to what may be seen as the moderate option, and that was, in possibly the most simple terms, an attempted federalisation of Ireland, an independent Parliament of Ireland with a British diktat of foreign policy. While a compromise for nationalists, this was absolute hell for unionists, who believed this was a sign of British abandonment. This brings us to our next player, the UVF. The UVF, or Ulster Volunteers, were the unionist response. Carson, a highly decorated figure of the British system, being both the Attorney General and the Lord of the Admiralty throughout his career. This political juggernaut, while being a Member of Parliament, set up the militant Ulster Volunteer Force, along with his many compatriots, one of whom being a fellow MP, Colonel William Payne, who is a decorated war veteran and the Chief of Staff Officer of the UVF. The UVF was established formally in the early days of January 1913 to resist Home Rule by any means necessary, even if that meant fighting the British establishment, something the men in charge, ironically, had served their entire lives and for the most part continued to serve. The severity of their opposition to all proponents of Home Rule cannot be overstated. They were willing to fight anybody that tried to separate them from Great Britain, no matter what flag they flew. This is best demonstrated by the bone-chilling memo to the local UVF commanders pertaining to the Larne Gun running operation, written by Colonel Payne.
If the authorities attempt to seize our arms and ammunition, it is of the utmost importance that the UVF should not be responsible for any violence which can be avoided. Attempts to prevent the seizure of our arms will be dealt with in the first instance by force of numbers. Only if the authorities commit the first act of aggression by firing will the UVF fire in reply. Every means will be used to point out to the authorities that they are responsible for the consequences of any action they may take. To protect our arms and volunteers, it is vital that any intelligence should be obtained at the earliest possible moment of any actions about to be taken by the authorities. Information of this sort might be obtained from policemen who sympathise with us.
And so the Larne Gun Run was planned. The plan was to bring in 25,000 guns and 3 million rounds of ammunition into the country through the strategic port of Larne. Larne was picked as it was deep in the Unionist territory of Ulster, and as opposed to Belfast, had an almost entirely Unionist population, where their acts would not be hindered. How would they get the guns though? Well, they had to go through Germany. But unlike the Irish Volunteers, who would repeat the process multiple times over the next 4 years, the German state was in no way sympathetic to the UVF. They had to procure these firearms privately. With the British and Germans against them, Crawford had purchased these rifles from an arms dealer named Spiro in northern Germany. He had procured a vessel named the SS Fanny to transport these guns. But there were a couple of issues. First of all, everything, apart from very small-scale smuggling operations up until this point had been ceased, and any transport headed for Ireland was on high alert due to the deteriorating political and military situation. Danish officials intercepted the ship, correctly guessing that the ship was going to arm militant groups. Luckily for Crawford, the Danes believed they were going to arm Icelandic independence forces who were vying for independence from Denmark. While a temporary setback, this meant that the British weren't yet aware of the scheme. Yet, to divert attention, another vessel was bought. It was renamed to the Mountjoy II, a reference to the infamous vessel the Mountjoy, one of King Billy's ships that had broken the siege of Derry only 200 years before. The arms were loaded onto the Mountjoy II, which headed straight for Larne. The UVF was mobilised fully, the entire motor corps and men lining pickets and road stops all the way from Belfast to Larne, roughly a 25-mile stretch. Only a handful of men knew the truth, and the UVF were told it was a drill. To divert the now suspicious authorities, a third ship was conscripted. This was a coal-bearing Trump steamer, who was to dock at Belfast in the most suspicious way possible, with a small contingent of trucks at the harbour to make it seem like this was the ship bearing the arms. The captain of the vessel delayed the authorities with an incredibly suspicious back and forth, before revealing the ship was indeed filled with coal. The authorities, realising they had been duped, made haste for Larne, but it was too late. Mountjoy II had already landed, and the thousands of UVF men told to load the cargo into the assembled trucks, which was no mean feat for 1914, when motorised transport was barely in its infancy. They were fed and watered while they worked by the Larne population, who cheered them on as they toiled, and they were transported to hidden depots around Ulster. Some of these depots were so well hidden, in fact, that some were only uncovered in 1969 when the British Army was sweeping the country for IRA arms dumps. Funnily enough, these arms would have a life beyond Ulster. When many Ulstermen joined the army at the outbreak of war, the British, full well knowing about the existence of these rifles, as the UVF had made their existence public as a propaganda move, asked for the rifles and the ammunition. All the ammunition was handed over, but none of the rifles. Rifles themselves were a hodgepodge mix of Italian, Austrian and German rifles, an unsavoury logistical nightmare if the guns were actually to be used by the UVF, especially since they only had 3 million rounds. Later, in the 40s, many of these guns were acquisitioned again, this time for the British Home Guard. The first of these rifles to be fired in combat were fired thus by Ethiopian militias fighting the Italians in the East Africa campaign. They had been given to Emperor Selassie of Ethiopia when Britain entered the war. The Larne Gun Run was indeed an impressive venture, but it cannot really be said to have helped the Unionist cause. In fact, the response by nationalists was to prove dire for the Unionist position. Membership of the Irish Volunteers exploded overnight by what was seen as a hostile action by Unionists. Rather than Home Rule, 26 counties in Ireland were to gain full republic status. The logistics, if they were ever to be used, was nightmarish too. 3 million rounds and 25,000 rifles, of different makes even, does not bode well for a militia of 100,000 men. They barely had enough rounds to train even 25,000, let alone 100,000. Many UVF members were unwilling to fight, with pretty terrible leadership and lukewarm allegiances. It can be said the gun run only sped up the exact thing they fought against, but nonetheless, it will be remembered as one of the most daring and largest gun smuggling operations by a private entity in European history. If you made it this far, thank you. Please, if you enjoyed the video or if you learned anything from it, please do like and subscribe, because this is a new venture for me, and any support that you think will help would be much appreciated. Comment, like, subscribe, whatever you want to do, feedback, all that. Just thank you.